And we are live. So, welcome in. Thank you for joining me. And first things first, we got to get this out of the way because some of the hot gang is kind of making a meme of how much I talk about Azerbaijan and Armenia and about fishing in the Caspian Sea. So, first thing is first, I'm going to just throw up a picture of a sturgeon just because I want to go fishing in the Caspian Sea and catch sturgeon. We'll just throw that out there. Whether it's Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, doesn't really matter. I just want to go and catch sturgeon. And Azerbaijan is the sturgeon capital of the world. So, but this conflict, the Nagorno-Karabakh, is absolutely fascinating to me. All fishing jokes aside, it is one of those things where you can really look at either side and pick out points where you agree and disagree. So today I have a video from the Caspian report just detailing some of the origins of the conflict. Like I mentioned in the last video, it changes hands quite a bit, the area. And they'll go over some of the territorial complaints and disputes of the area. So we'll get into it, and I'll stop it occasionally because we don't want to get a copyright strike things. And it's a pain in the ass with YouTube because you have to delete some of the video. You have to do this, do that. There's actually a pain to deal with. I used to just get copyright strikes to get them out of the way, but then you have to edit some out of the video or mute the audio. So yeah, YouTube kind of won that battle. But we'll get into the video here. And it's from the Caspian report. And I don't know too much about them. I know they do some content and they try to present both sides. But I mean, the Caspian report would probably have the best information on the stuff that's happening in the Caspian Sea. So let's jump right into it.
For the past 2 decades, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has dominated the geopolitics of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Last month, in April 2016, a 4-day-long skirmish erupted which cost the lives of at least 200 soldiers. In a previous Caspian report,
So yeah, this video is primarily going to cover the conflict 4-day war in 2016. It has recently escalated. There have been people that have died in the Nagorno-Karabakh, but there's also been violence throughout the rest of the world through protests. I don't know if that's a COVID thing or if that's just the normal thing because I didn't really follow it in 2016. But yeah, there has been violence. I've seen some people get their ass kicked, and I've seen some people get kicked while they're on the ground. And I plan on doing a stream later just showcasing some of the videos I've found as far as some of the violence that's extra national as far as this conflict. But yeah, we'll continue with the video.
explained the geopolitical and military status quo, we also recounted how the conflict is a potential hotspot that could involve regional players such as Russia and Turkey. Given the geopolitical significance of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and the lack of proper materials on the subject, in this report we will go over the origins of the conflict. My name is Shirvan and this is Caspian Report. For more information on the channel, please visit the Patreon page. The history of Azerbaijanis and Armenians in Karabakh is a complicated one. A number of studies show that the genetic traces of both ethnicities are actually closely intertwined. The languages, religions, and customs may have changed over time, but in essence, both communities, along with many other ethnic
Which is actually very interesting that they're close genetically to the same people, even though one group is going to be predominantly Muslim, the other group's going to be predominantly Christian, but genetically they're close to the same, which is really interesting given the region. And it's going to go over to the different territorial disputes of the region, like they've been conquered by different groups throughout this whole thing. And so it's kind of interesting. You even look at this map and all the different colors. Now they'll explain the different colors, but I mean, unless you're the blue people, which is mostly vacant land, like there's different regions, but they also, I guess I want to convey that they were, before the Soviet Union took them over, they were mixed. kind of like a similar situation they are in Iran, where they just mix together, they get along just fine, except for when the Nagorno-Karabakh comes up, and then they get a little bit testy, but they live together just fine in other regions. And these origins are going to go over, I believe, how they became so divided when their origins they used to live together all the time.
Groups share the heritage of the Caucasus region. This narrative is not accepted by the national paradigms. In fact, each side belittle the history of the other. But both nations had lost their independent kingdoms centuries ago to neighboring empires. Yet, what Armenians and Azerbaijanis
That is some cool footage. The guys on the horses, the guys with the swords. It's probably film, but yeah, that would just be a cool time in history to be kind of a fly on the wall and just kind of view this kind of warfare as compared to modern warfare. When they're on horses, they had castles. They were trying to conquer each other through brute force and brute strength. It would just be fun to, not necessarily change history, but just sit there and just kind of watch it unfold because they didn't have the technology back then to film some of the things that went on.
consider their lands lies right at the crossroads of empires. For centuries, the Ottoman sultans, the Iranian shahs, and the Russian tsars contested the lands in the South Caucasus and fought many wars over it.
So you look at these empires. So you have Russia to the north, you have the Ottomans, which were the Turks, and above them the Austrian Habsburg Empire, and then the Safavids, which is modern day Iran. So, like, modern day Iran owned Armenia and Azerbaijan, well, in the Safavid Empire days. And of course, you have the Manching and the Mughal empires as well, just being there because they're at least close enough geographically. But yeah, so you have kind of the battle of the Ottomans, the Turks, and the Safavids, the Iranians, or the Persians. Persians would probably be a better accurate term to describe it.
During the territorial exchanges, the borders were redrawn, the names of towns were renamed, and every empire tried to change the demographics in their favor by
Yeah, the depiction, they all look British. They all look like the British Empire. Yeah.
deporting and settling ethnic groups. Even though the South Caucasus lived under the shadows of empires, the locals usually got along fine. Azerbaijanis who share linguistic ties with Turkey and a Shia Muslim creed with Iran coexisted with Oriental Orthodox Armenians who share the regional customs. Then, in the 19th century,
See, like I was saying, they got along before. And there's probably going to get to it in the video where it talks about the Soviet Union influence. And it's like one of those things. If you can go back in time and you had to choose one, whether you kill Hitler or you kill Stalin, I think a lot of the influence of Stalin because Hitler was actually defeated. Like, I think Stalin would be the other one because you would figure you would kill Stalin and then defeat Hitler and the world would be completely changed. Versus like killing Hitler and then Stalin still does his thing around the world. But yeah, they got along before. This wasn't an issue in ancient times because they got along. Even though they had practiced different religions, they got along. They came together and got along. And I think that's one of the things that's going to have to take place in order for this conflict to be resolved. They're going to have to come together. They're going to have to get along, which right now neither side really wants to do. They don't want to come together and get along. Armenia wants Nagorno-Karabakh to be pretty much South Armenia. Azerbaijan wants their territory back and wants it to be part of Azerbaijan. Like, neither side saying, well, maybe we create a Nagorno-Karabakh state. It's kind of the thing of Armenia, but they don't want too many Azerbaijanis to come back in and influence the power and take away that Armenian state. Because there was a lot of people displaced in this conflict after the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan is going to Azerbaijan, Armenia is going from Azerbaijan to Armenia, like a lot of exchange of people back and forth in an area where they used to get along. They used to be a community with one another, but now they can't get along. And a lot of this is going to be the result of the Soviet Union.
The Russian Empire broke the power balance and annexed Iran's portion of the Caucasus. This included the region of Karabakh, which means Black Garden in the Azerbaijani language. Following this, the Russians conducted demographic surveys in the newly conquered territories to assess the strategic needs. The earliest objective demographic survey of the Karabakh region dates to 1823. According to the statistics, 91% of the population was Muslim and the remainder was Christian. This obviously refers to Muslim Azerbaijanis and Christian Armenians. The Russians proceeded.
That kind of begs the question. They're making some assumptions there. Were there any Christian Azerbaijanis or Muslim Armenians that were included in here? Because I know, generally speaking, nowadays, Armenia is a Christian country, Azerbaijan's a mostly Muslim country. But back in that time, did they try to convert each other back and forth? Like, that's one of the interesting dynamics. They used to assume that all the Armenians are Christian, all the Azerbaijanis are Muslim. But I'm wondering if it was different back then. Because I've heard some things too, as far as like when this conflict, when they started splitting up and sending people, like you had Armenians that were in Azerbaijan that married Azerbaijani men who were Muslim. And then you had Armenians who either married Azerbaijani men or Azerbaijani women who were Christians. So I'm wondering, it's easy to say, well, there's that divide there. One's a Christian, one's a Muslim. I'm wondering how much of the intermixing actually went on, and they're actually just kind of entities where they're kind of mixed at least some level. Is one of the things I kind of wonder with this conflict.
Proceeded to abolish the former Iranian provinces and created new ones. What is now Azerbaijan and Armenia were part of three.
So this is an interesting map. So you have Baku, which is in Azerbaijan, and then you have parts of Turkey, and then Yerevan, which is parts of Armenia. And so he's going to say, I think he's going to say it divided up into three territories. But just look at how these different areas kind of had their own autonomy in this. And then now it's just pretty much Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and then Azerbaijan. And so before it was like all these different areas. So I don't want to say balkanization would have been the right thing because there's a lot of problems with went on with balkanization. But you see all these different territories, and somebody as kind of an American, it'd be like, well, just make these all states underneath one thing. Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. But I imagine that was tried in the past and didn't work out, similar to the balkanization of Yugoslavia. But we'll continue to watch and find out.
Provinces: the Baku Governorate, the Elizabethpol Governorate, and the Yerevan Governorate. The last demographic survey in these provinces was conducted in 1897, and the ethnic layout was as the following. First, 58.7% of the Baku Governorate consisted of ethnic Azerbaijanis, while Armenians formed 6.3%.
So, what was the other 45%? Were they Chechen? Were they Russian? Were they Turkmens? Were they Uzbeks? Like, that's kind of information I kind of want to find out because, there wasn't a big Armenian population in Baku, but there's still nearly 45% of the population that we don't know about from this graph. So I would assume, maybe some Georgians, some Chechens, maybe some Turkmens, maybe some Turkish people, maybe some Uzbeks. Like, it's interesting when there's like 45% of the demographic that's not mentioned there in this chart.
Second, the Elizabethpol region had an Azerbaijani population of at least 60.8% and an Armenian population of 33.3%. Finally, the third province, the Yerevan Governorate, consisted of 37.8%.
So you look at this, so Baku was primarily Azerbaijani. The Elizabethpol region, or the governorate, was primarily Azerbaijani. That's modern day Nagorno-Karabakh. And then the Yerevan region, modern day Armenia, was more of an Armenian population. Now, their population sizes are all similar. If you look at them, they're between 780 and 874,000 people. So really similar population size. Armenians are probably still the minority overall, but I mean they're intermixed. So like one of the issues with the Nagorno-Karabakh is right now it's close to 95, 96, 97% Armenian. And it was 60% Azerbaijani. And you can see where the modern day conflict comes because the Azerbaijani people feel like it's their land because they were the majority before they were kicked out before the Armenians. But the Armenians would be, we kicked you out, so now it's ours. So kind of one of those things in modern warfare where you take over territories because of your military power. But we'll continue to go. This is the 1897 census that was conducted by the Russian government. And hopefully it's accurate, but it is the Russians, so it may be skewed to whoever they favored more at the moment. But it's the data that we have.
Azerbaijanis and 53.2% Armenians. Within these provinces were secondary administrative divisions called uyezds. This is where things get even more complicated. For example, even though ethnic Azerbaijanis.
So we'll just look at this graph and we'll start with Baku to kind of break it down. So Baku is 34% Azerbaijani and 12% Armenian. So it was a majority of somebody else that was in Baku at the time. I don't know if they're Turks, Turkmens, Russians, Chechens. Like it was a majority of somebody else in the capital of Azerbaijan as we know it today. And then Gyakche, pretty much majority Azerbaijan. Desviat, Kuba. Kuba wasn't that high Azerbaijan. He doesn't have any information on Armenians. So I don't know, like, based on this, whether they're Georgians, whether they're Turks, whether they're Russians, Chechens, Turkmens, Uzbeks. Like, what was the other demographic? It'd be something interesting to look at, kind of like the different governates of this region. And then Shimak, 73%, 11%. Now, Elizabethpol, you have 70, 74, 71, 63, 51, 57, 69, 45. And then Shashua at the bottom, 53% Armenian. I believe that's the modern day capital of the Nagorno-Karabakh. So it was primarily Armenian, but all the other cities there are primarily Azerbaijani. Okay, the highest Zangezur was pretty close to 50-50, but all the other ones primarily Azerbaijani. Now the Yerevan governorate, so you have 4% in Alexander Pol, which just probably conquered by Alexander the Great, I'd imagine, just by its name. And then Nakhchivan, which is the modern day autonomous territory of Azerbaijan, 63% of Azerbaijani. And then Novo Bayazet, 66%, and Sumral, 30% Armenian. Sashur Delagraz, 27% Armenian. Erevan, 38% Armenian. And then Ich Miadadzin, 62% Armenian. So even the Azerbaijanis had the capital of Armenia in a majority, but some of the other regions, the Armenians had a little bit more, and overall they had a little bit more. So I'm wondering if Alexandropol probably had a higher population. I don't know that for sure, but it's just some interesting kind of data to kind of look at and just say, well, they were really mixed, but generally Azerbaijanis had a little bit more people in most territories, but they were mixed. And so, like, that's where the conflict's going to probably go later, is they're no longer mixed in either area. They're either Armenian or they're Azerbaijani. They're not either or. Like, they stopped mixing. They segregated themselves away from each other. But we'll continue with the video.
Formed the overall majority in the Elizabeth Pol Governorate. The ethnic layout of the Shushinsky region consisted of 53.3% Armenians and 45.3% Azerbaijanis. At the same time, the population of the Yerevan Uyezd, which is now the capital of Armenia, consisted of 51.4% Azerbaijanis and 38.5% Armenians. Another example is the Nakhchivan region, which was part of the Yerevan Governorate but had a 63.7% Azerbaijani majority and a 34.4% Armenian minority. Even though the demographic layout changed over time, these administrative arrangements remained in place until the Russian Civil War in 1917. These numbers are the earliest objective demographic observations.
So you look at this, and the one group that isn't represented here in either country in significance is the Kurds, which is unfortunate. I think the Kurds are been a very good people, very good ally to the United States, and the United States hasn't been as great of an ally to the Kurds. But yeah, they no longer exist in Azerbaijan or Armenia, but they did have some sort of presence here before the Russians.
Of the region, and they show just how widespread and intermingled both communities lived. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, Azerbaijanis and Armenians, along with neighboring Georgians, seized the opportunity and declared a unified Transcaucasian state. However, national
See, I kind of called that. I said they were going to be like Yugoslavia. They were going to try to create a Caucasian Yugoslavia. But I'd imagine that's not going to end well. And I think he was just explaining that.
Nationalist sentiment was running high, and the concept didn't last as all three nations dismantled in independent states. Since the territorial boundaries were still based on the Russian governorates and uyezds, territorial disputes followed. Georgia and Armenia waged a brief war in which Armenia gained the Lori province, which until 1917 was part of the Tbilisi Governorate, but a much larger war erupted between Azerbaijan and Armenia over a number of territories including Sumarlu, Yerevan, Zangezur, Nakhchivan, and Karabakh.
So if you see this map, and this is what a lot of Azerbaijanis are getting at, is they won Karabakh. They won the Karabakh region. And Armenia kind of had a couple of those regions. One of those regions actually in Turkey is what Armenia owned. But they said, well, as soon as we declared our independence, we had this region. It was our region. We have claim to the land that we previously occupied, that we won kind of in a war. And Tavish, where that modern conflict as well, they originally occupied that land as well.
At the time, most of the international community had recognized Sumarlu and Yerevan as part of Armenia and Nakhchivan, Zengezur, and Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. Regardless of this, revolts appeared all over the region. What's more is that at the time,
That is really a cool photo. I don't know if that's going to be doctored or was like 1918. The photography wasn't that great, but yeah, just look at the weaponry, look at them marching. It is great kind of photography. But I don't know if they had that technology back then because I think the TV was invented a little bit later. I may be wrong on that. But yeah, I like looking at this historic videos, this historic footage, just because it's not something that we see today in kind of modern conflicts. It's more like, well, this building blew up. Here's the aftermath. This is it. But yeah, this and some of the World War II documentaries, Vietnam documentaries, is really cool to see.
Baku was the largest oil-producing region in the world. The strategic significance of oil attracted new empires to the region. The Ottoman and British empires attempted to gain influence and control the fates of the newly established Armenian and Azerbaijani republics.
Yeah, neither of which are very good empires. So the British, yeah, they really, it's not really covered, but they weren't the best stewards of their empire. And the Ottomans, of course, were authoritarian. So yeah, it's really unfortunate because this conflict may have been avoided if the Ottomans and the British would have stood out, but then maybe the Russians would have came in. Like, so it's one of those things. But yeah, these two countries just barely declare their independence, and all of a sudden, well, you produce oil, so here comes the British, here comes the Ottomans, and they're going to take this from you, even though you're economically productive, because they're an empire.
So the First Armenian-Azerbaijani War played out in the context of World War I. It was a blend of complex alliances, diplomatic negotiations, military raids, and rogue generals, as well as imperial.
That dude in the middle, his mustache is fantastic. Okay, but I like these images because these are not something that you see on typical TV. It's not something that you see. You don't see these kind of images. People posing, the bandolier across the guy's chest on the right, and just look at like how like tough these guys look. They don't look like somebody you want to get in a bare knuckle fight with. Like, yeah, they look tough, they look dignified. And I realize it's just a portrait, but yeah, stuff like this is just fantastic for the eyes to see.
Ambitions. Both sides made gains and losses, and at the backdrop of the war, Azerbaijani civilians were massacred and Armenian villages were pillaged. Eventually, in 1920, the Azerbaijani army managed to gain control over most of its territorial claims concerning Nakhchivan, Zengezur, and Karabakh. However, in early April 1920, news reached the authorities in Baku that the Red Army was
And here come the fucking Russians. Yep, it was only a matter of time. So, I mean, it's either you got the British gonna rule you, which they haven't been the best actors. You have the Ottomans who just fell in World War One, or you have the Russians that are coming in. And if I had those three options to choose, I would probably choose the British or the Ottomans. The Russian Empire was absolutely brutal, and they would be the one I would choose last in the list. Like, if you had to choose the British, the Ottomans, the Russians, or the Nazis, I would probably choose the British, then the Ottomans, then the Nazis, then the Russians. Just like kind of I broke down kind of a little bit earlier, like if you had to choose to kill one, whether you could go back in time, you can either kill Hitler or you can kill Stalin. I think there's a moral case to be made that you would kill Stalin before Hitler. Because there's the Holodomor in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, which is modern day Kazakhstan. And there's all the gulags, like the Soviets and the Baltics. And then, yeah, the Soviets were really brutal. And over time, they killed a lot more people than the Germans did, even though what the Germans did was absolutely horrific. Like, you were going to defeat Hitler. We really didn't defeat the Soviets for 50 years. So if you go back in time and take out Stalin and defeat the Soviets then, you have 50 more years. You don't really know what's going to happen, but it's not Stalinism. So we were going to defeat Hitler anyway, so you would take out Stalin, would be the argument there. But yeah, the Russians coming in, and this isn't going to be good for Azerbaijan. It may not be good for Armenia either, or Georgia. So we'll see what happens.
Intent on conquering the oil-rich Azerbaijan. Baku faced a difficult decision and transferred all its military forces to fight off the Soviet invasion of Azerbaijan. Following this, the abandoned Azerbaijani positions in Zangezur and Karabakh were overrun by Armenian forces, but the situation was not to last. When the Red Army finished conquering Azerbaijan, they marched straight into Armenia and then Georgia. For the Caucasus, the short experience with independence came to an end. Following the Soviet conquest,
And so then the territories that they had, because they couldn't align and fight the Russians, so Azerbaijan fell, then Armenia fell, got split into halfway of Turkey, and then Georgia fell. So the Caucasus fell. Russians came in and just beat the living crap out of them. Lots of people died because that's what Russians do.
the Bolsheviks established the Kafbiro in 1921. The committee, led by Stalin, was to supervise the subordination of the Caucasus into the Soviet Union. The authorities in Yerevan intended to use diplomacy to gain control over Nakhchivan, Zangezur, and Karabakh, which had previously been recognized as part of Azerbaijan. Armenia proceeded to request the authorities in Moscow for territorial adjustments, and so the Kafbiro Committee assessed the territorial claims by Armenia against Azerbaijan and then settled them. The committee ruled that for historic, demographic, economic, and political reasons, the Karabakh region was to remain part of Azerbaijan. Nowadays,
Which isn't really important to note through the modern conflict that we are currently having now. One of the issues why Azerbaijan doesn't want to settle with Armenia's peace agreement is because the Soviets awarded it to them. They were a socialist republic of the Soviets, and the Soviets rewarded it to them. And it was a period, I mean, they occupied it before the Soviets invaded. It's kind of where that territory conflict comes into play. And the Soviets said, well, it is part of Azerbaijan.
many media outlets inaccurately simplify the events by stating that Stalin gave Karabakh to Azerbaijan. However, the original document of the Kafbiro makes no mention of giving, transfer, or annexation. It only mentions that Karabakh remained part of Azerbaijan. In essence, when the Soviet army invaded the region, they recognized the authority of Azerbaijan over Karabakh and later settled the conflict in favor of Baku. However, in 1923, as a compromise, Stalin made additional territorial changes as a means to maintain a power balance in the region. The Soviet authorities created the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region within Azerbaijan. The borders of this new autonomy were drawn specifically to establish an Armenian majority population. Furthermore, the region of Zangezur, despite having an Azerbaijani majority, was transferred to Armenia, and this transferred Nakhchivan into an exclave, which too was granted an autonomy within Azerbaijan.
Now, he mentioned that they credit Stalin, but that's one thing that Stalin did. You see what he did? Is he kind of fucked up both countries to say, kind of, well, I have power over you. If you leave me, well, you're going to be in this war, and then we'll come in from the other side and take you over. It's kind of the way it probably went down. But yeah, he created one little area with an Armenian majority, which is the modern day Nagorno-Karabakh. And then he cut off an autonomous zone for Azerbaijan, so they'd have to go through Armenia to get to their autonomous zone. And that way they would have to go to Russia to make peace agreements, and that way Russia kind of controlled them, because if Azerbaijan became the aggressor, then Stalin would send his troops into Armenia to fight them off. If Armenia became the aggressor, Stalin would send his troops into Azerbaijan to fight them off. So that way he can maintain control over the region.
A complicated issue just got even more confusing. As the Azerbaijani and Armenian communities were integrated into the Soviet Union, the communist leaders of both republics continued their attempts to change the demographic layouts. Over the next few decades, ethnic Azerbaijanis from Zengezur and Yerevan were deported, as were Armenians deported from Nakhchivan. A region that was once home to multicultural communities gradually transformed into distinct modern nation-states.
And I think that was the plan of the Russians all along, was to create these ethno-states. That way they can maintain control over both of them. Because they may hate each other, but they may look for Russia for help. So it's really unfortunate. You imagine you're at the place of these lives. You're an Armenian living in Azerbaijan. You get kicked out of your home and get deported to this other territory where you've never been. Or you're in Azerbaijan in this region. Your family's been there for centuries, and you get deported to a territory you may have never been. And so the Soviets kind of really messed up this conflict in a lot of ways. And they kind of laid the groundwork for what it is the modern day by some of their policies. Rather than just having the whole thing be Azerbaijan or the whole thing be Armenia, they split it in half and gave it weird boundaries. So then there would be conflict, and they'd rely on the Soviets to help them be the peacekeeper essentially in the conflict.
It took a long time before both communities learned to trust and cooperate with each other, but during the Soviet era, Azerbaijanis and Armenians lived and worked side by side. The reconciliation process was made easier due to the fact that both groups have much in common in terms of culture. In fact, there was a genuine friendship between the two communities. Yet, in the final years of the Soviet Union, the old feelings of mutual distrust and hostility re-emerged. Despite decades
Which is a really great thing to note. It's like, well, they got along before. They were living together. They were working together. They had a country, even though it was ruled by one or the other, that was multicultural. It was a melting pot between the two groups. But I imagine as we get further in this video, that's going to become less and less the case.
of peace and trust, it only took a small number of unfortunate events to reintroduce a full-blown conflict. It is for this reason that historians argue that the Russians had never settled the conflict, rather they had installed the conditions for a divide and rule strategy. It was the fear of an all-out war that kept the Soviet Union together, and without Russian oversight, Armenians and Azerbaijanis were destined to wage another war. And
Which is true, because it happened in the future. Like, it was one of the things they just explained, like, divide them, so then Russia looks kind of like the peacekeeper, can play both sides. And then if they want to break away, they actually got to fight each other and fight Russia, so they're not going to fight that fight.
that is exactly what happened in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Eventually, the relations reached a boiling point when the authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh voted for a unification with Armenia. Tensions between the two groups escalated. Azerbaijanis were deported from Armenia, and ethnic Armenians became targets for nationalists in Azerbaijan. And the Soviet state media only made matters worse. Sporadic violence erupted all over the region. People were getting killed on both sides. The situation only worsened with the formal collapse of the Soviet Union. This status of affairs lasted from 1988 to 1992, yet despite all
So what they're not bringing up here is the Russians actually invaded Azerbaijan towards the end of the Cold War. Like Mikhail Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize 7 months after invading Azerbaijan to try to restore the conflict. I don't want to say restore the peace. He wanted to restore the conflict. He wanted to keep them fighting because he could sell weapons to both sides. And so he could support both sides, so he could still be under the Soviet sphere of influence. So Azerbaijan didn't run to Turkey or didn't run to Iran. They were still underneath the Soviet sphere of influence.
the violence, even in the early days of the conflict, both sides aimed to prevent a war. In fact, a consensus between Yerevan and Baku was reached in September 1991. Armenia renounced all its claims to Azerbaijani territory, and this became known as the Zheleznovodsk Declaration. However, the peace treaty was disrupted when a peacekeeping delegation aboard a transport helicopter consisting of Russian and Kazakh observers, as well as a dozen high-ranking Azerbaijani state officials, was shot down. All the passengers were killed in the crash, and an investigation committee revealed that the helicopter was shot down from the ground by large caliber weapons. There are many conspiracy theories on the shootdown of the helicopter, ranging from Russian KGB interference to rogue generals, but what we do know for certain is that as a result of the sabotage, the peace treaty between Azerbaijan and Armenia was never ratified. As the conflict escalated, both sides
That guy's mustache. You should call this the mustache war. But yeah, that guy has a decent mustache. I mean, just look at that thing. Fantastic. But yeah, it's really an unfortunate situation that was extirpated by the Russians. Like I said, the Russians didn't really want peace. They wanted to be odds at each other so they can control the influence of each one of them. But the people there just wanted peace. And they were people that got along before. It wasn't like they had this conflict before the Russians had. They lived together. They had different, zones. But before the Russians got involved, they got along. And even during some of the Russian occupation, they got along. It was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they start deporting each side, creating an ethno state, is what created the problem.
started targeting civilians and committed various acts of war crimes and atrocities. The most infamous of these events was the Hojari Massacre, in which the Russian 366th Motor Rifle Regiment was directly involved.
Yeah, and that's not something that's covered in this conflict, the Hojari Massacre. So, like, the Armenians and the Russians went in, did a night raid to an Azerbaijani village in Nagorno-Karabakh. And so then people started fleeing. They started running away. Like, we got to get to safety. We have to go somewhere. And then they stood on the border and gunned them down. And he's right when he mentions kind of war crimes on both sides because the Azerbaijanis weren't that great. There was the same, not as extreme level, but there was the same sentiment in the Azerbaijani owned territories. One of the reasons why the Armenians escaped to Armenia and the Azerbaijanis also escaped to Azerbaijan to get out of that so they didn't get gunned down by either side. It was a dirty, dirty conflict between both sides, and they did a lot of things that would have them hung in the international court. But because it's this region and not a lot of people know about it, not a lot of people care about it, but in general, not a lot of people care about like what the Soviets did and all their violence, all their war crimes, all their fabricated famines during their time. Because the Soviets didn't have any freedom of the press, so a lot of it was underreported. But yeah, like going back to the same thing, if you had to kill one, in 1945, would you kill Stalin or would you kill Hitler? I think you kill Stalin every time because the atrocities committed by Stalin and that regime were absolutely abhorrent. Like, absolutely nobody should ever defend what the Soviets did in the Baltics, somewhat in the Balkans, but in the Caucasus and then in the Stan region of Asia. Like, what the Soviets did is absolutely abhorrent. And it's borderline worse than what Hitler did trying to exterminate all the Jews.
The news of the massacre had such a profound impact that it forced the resignation of the Azerbaijani president Mutalibov, and as the level of hostility increased, former friends and neighbors became enemies. It seemed that war was unstoppable. Yet, cool heads still prevailed in Baku and Yerevan as both sides once again attempted to reconcile. This time,
So that's one of the things that's really interesting is Iran played mediator between the two. Because Armenians and Azerbaijanis live in Iran, work together peacefully, like what this region was even before the Soviets and even during the Soviet occupation until the end of the Soviet occupation. Like, Azerbaijanis and Armenians can get along, but due to the Soviet intervention in the USSR, it put a big divide between the two. And I think that's ultimately one of the resolutions of the conflict is, integrating both sides, whether it's Armenia or Azerbaijan, bringing Armenians to Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis to Armenia, and then also in the Nagorno-Karabakh, returning the refugees from Azerbaijan into that region and just kind of creating a multicultural system. It may take some work. The United States went through that with segregation, but ultimately that's, in my mind, going to be the solution of the conflict is to integrate both societies with one another, maybe bring in some Georgians as well, and just bring people together rather than have this division. But it's going to take diplomatic ties from both sides, diplomatic resolutions from both sides to make this happen.
the presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan met in Iran in what is now known as the Tehran Agreement. Both sides committed themselves to peace and agreed to withdraw their armies from the conflict zone. However, the peace efforts failed the very next day when Armenian troops, in breach of the Tehran Agreement, attacked and captured the Azerbaijani town of Shusha. Following this, the negotiations ceased and a full-scale war ensued. It's important to note that President Terpetrosyan of Armenia had not actually planned to double-cross his Azerbaijani counterpart. Rather, the Armenian president was not in control of his military forces. Someone else was calling the shots, and two times already a peaceful outcome had been sabotaged. But even at the time, it was evident that some third party was determined to force Azerbaijan and Armenia into a war and push out any Iranian influence by embarrassing Tehran's political efforts. Ultimately, the country that gained the most from these subversions was Russia. There is no evidence to prove this, but many analysts consider either the KGB or the GRU responsible for instigating a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as it made the South Caucasus more manageable for Moscow. Either way, the collapse of the peace talks paved the way for a full-scale war between Armenian and Azerbaijani troops. However, ever since the fall of Shusha, which is the most strategic point in Karabakh and the cradle of Azerbaijani culture, the political divisions in Baku deepened. An armed revolt ousted the acting president only to be
So yeah, they had kind of this peace agreement, but because of some of the corruption of, well, pretty much all former Soviet states have a little bit of corruption. A lot of them are mafia ran because that's kind of the way it had to be during the Soviet Union. And so there was a lot of corruption. And so, like, the president who negotiated the peace treaty from Armenia didn't have control over his military because he didn't really control it. He can make whatever peace deal he wanted to, but he didn't have control because he was just a head of the government, but the whole body and tail was another part of the government.
Replaced by the former communist president, who too was replaced in an election, and then the elected president was deposed in a coup. With the Azerbaijanis distracted,
That's quite the imagery there. So they had a president who was taken over, another one gets elected, well, he's thrown out in a coup. Like, yeah, these former Soviet republics have issues. Like, they're mafia ran pretty much. And a lot of times it just takes a strong armed dictator to maintain the peace in these areas, which is really unfortunate. But that's kind of the reality of the situation from the former Soviet republics.
in a political power play back in the capital, Armenian forces managed to push further and further ahead. 2 years into the war and 30,000 to 36,000 deaths later, the Bishkek Protocol was signed in 1994, which calls for a ceasefire between the opposing sides. The ceasefire left Armenia in control of a substantial large territory. Not only did Yerevan control nearly all of Nagorno-Karabakh, but the country also seized 7 adjacent Azerbaijani regions that were not part of the initial war goal.
So that's one of the other things with Azerbaijan's gripe with this. And I know Armenia won them as far as like war and conflict, but it's one of those things they were negotiating a peace, and Armenia took a bunch of Azerbaijani land and they want that land back. So even if Nagorno Karabakh becomes its own autonomous region, this deal is going to have to be made with Azerbaijan getting their land back in the region, which is something Armenia isn't willing to negotiate, which makes it a kind of a frozen conflict, but also makes it not as much as a power keg as the former Yugoslavia and the Baltic region, the Balkan region. But yeah, Azerbaijan's going to want their land back, even if Nagorno Karabakh isn't its own country, because that was something they believe that was stole for them through peace talks through with Armenia to end the war in 1994.
This brings the total size of occupied territories to nearly 11,500 square kilometers, which is far larger than Nagorno-Karabakh's 4,400 square kilometer terrain. The territorial changes were significant for both countries, however, perhaps even more decisive were the demographic changes. As a result of the war, about 250,000 Azerbaijanis from Armenia fled to Azerbaijan, and roughly another 600,000 Azerbaijanis fled the conflict zone in Karabakh to the remainder of Azerbaijan. This brings the total number of Azerbaijani refugees and internally displaced persons to about 850,000 people. As for the Armenian side, an estimated 400,000 Armenians fled Azerbaijan.
And so you see kind of each side's kind of gripe to this. About 500,000 Armenians had to leave Azerbaijan, and then close to about 900,000 Azerbaijanis had to leave Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh. And so, like, rather than creating kind of a multicultural state, they created kind of ethno states where kind of I broke down in the last video 97% of Armenian and Nagorno Karabakh is Armenian, 90% of Azerbaijan is Azerbaijani. I mean, it's only 10%, but Azerbaijani, you'll see them on Twitter, they'll be claiming, well, we're more diverse. Well, it's not really that diverse. It's kind of like Wyoming, where a majority of the populace is one ethnic race. And so it's one of those things that's going to make this conflict really hard to solve unless they can come together and integrate both sides. Create kind of like, well, the people that were pushed out of Nagorno Karabakh can go back from Azerbaijan. The people that were pushed out of Azerbaijan by the Azerbaijanis can go back as Armenians into Azerbaijan would be the ideal solution to the conflict. Return these refugees to the places where they grew up, where they were from, is how you're going to resolve this conflict. But neither side right now seems to want to do that.
And settled in Armenia, and nowadays Nagorno-Karabakh is inhabited by about 146,000 ethnic Armenians. However, the total population spread over Karabakh taken as a whole is roughly 400,000 people. Following the ceasefire, diplomatic negotiations began. President Petrosyan and his Azerbaijani counterpart Aliyev were close to a compromise. A phased settlement was accepted by both leaders. Armenia was to return the occupied regions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, and in return Azerbaijan would lift the blockade against Armenia. The status of Nagorno-Karabakh would be postponed and settled later on. However, Petrosyan was forced to step down by February 1998 by his Prime Minister Kocharyan. Kocharyan stalled the peace talks with Aliyev, but a year later the two sides were close to a new deal. Armenia would return the territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, international peacekeeping troops would be deployed, and Nagorno-Karabakh itself would become an autonomy within Azerbaijan. This second agreement too was derailed in 1999 when a group of armed gunmen stormed the Armenian parliament, killing 8 and wounding dozens of Armenian officials. It was never
Yeah, that kind of puts a damper in negotiations. When an armed gunman goes in there and starts gunning down people while they're trying to negotiate. But that happened in Armenia, so I don't know if it was Azerbaijanis there or if it was Armenian nationalists or pan Armenianists wanting to go in there and not give the territory to Azerbaijan. But yeah, if they would have followed this peace accord, I don't think this would be a conflict anymore. I think Nagorno Karabakh would be an autonomous Armenian zone, and then the territories around it would be Azerbaijan. Now, as part of the UN kind of thing, they'd have to create a road or transport system between Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh. But I mean, if they did these things and they removed all the territory around the Nagorno Karabakh and returned it to Azerbaijan, I think Azerbaijan would settle for that rather than try to retake it.
explain what really happened or what had motivated the gunmen, but in a 2005 interview, former Russian FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko stated that the GRU, the military intelligence agency of Russia, was behind the shooting in an effort to derail the peace progress, which would have resolved the Karabakh conflict. No
It's always the fucking Russians. They are always the people that are kind of intermingled in this. Now, the Russians really want to play both sides in this, but they really don't want the conflict resolved either. Because if the conflict's resolved, then Azerbaijan can do business with whoever they want to, and Armenia can do business with whoever they want to, and it kind of cuts Russia out of the deal. But if Russia can keep the conflict going, they continue to fund both sides with military weaponry, and then at the end of the day, probably support Armenia, maybe. I tend to believe that their economic interests are more aligned with Azerbaijan at this point, but it is in their best economic interest to play both sides. So yeah, this doesn't surprise me at all. The Russians trying to intervene the peace process to keep the area in flux, so they can have influence over both sides.
No evidence was provided to support these allegations, but nonetheless the peace talks were slowed down during the remainder of Kocharyan's presidency. It was only in 2007 when the peace talks gained momentum with the introduction of the Madrid Principles. This roadmap was further updated in 2011, and it basically requires Armenia to withdraw its forces from the region and calls for peacekeeping forces instead. Following this, Nagorno-Karabakh would receive security guarantees and the region's legal status would be resolved through diplomacy. In the meantime, Armenia would temporarily maintain a corridor with Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan would lift the blockade against Armenia and communications between the two would be restored. For over a decade, the peace talks have been conducted along these lines.
Okay, so let's just look and break down kind of these peace talks from the Madrid principles. So the first one is Armenia returns 5 of the 7 regions surrounding the Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijani control. Russians provide a peacekeeping operation, which the Russians won't do. Interim status in Nagorno-Karabakh, providing guarantees for security and self-governance, so creating an autonomous zone, kind of creating its own country. The Lechin and Kebeljar region remain under the control of Armenia. Azerbaijan lifts the blockade on Armenia. Restoration of communications. The right to internally displaced persons and refugees to return their former places of residence. Talks begin on legal status in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a good compromise between both sides. You get the refugees that can go back to the region to create kind of a multicultural region, which would be the ideal solution to this conflict where you return the refugees so you don't have an ethno state. I think that's really good. The legal status, it can be an autonomous zone, but like you said before, it's pretty much going to be South Armenia. I don't like the Russian peacekeeping operation, but Armenia returning 5 of the 7 regions, yeah, that would help with the peace process. Azerbaijan lifting the blockade helps as well. It'll help Armenia as well. Like, this just seems, other than the Russia peacekeeping operation, a win-win for both sides. Like, both sides don't get everything they want, but they get a large piece of what they want here in the Madrid principles.
Yet, the talks are no step closer to a peace treaty. The reason for the passive negotiations is due to the changing geopolitics of the region. The fact is that energy-rich Azerbaijan's economy has skyrocketed, and the country has forged close strategic relations with Turkey and Israel. Furthermore, Baku's diplomatic influence has expanded due to its groundbreaking energy policy, and at the same time, Armenia has been absorbed into the Russian sphere of influence, with Iran being the closest geopolitical alternative.
See, I don't really agree with that because Russia also has interest in Azerbaijan. And Iran also has interest in Azerbaijan as well. But Armenia really doesn't have many other friends. Turkey gets involved, of course, they have Greece, but that's really their only other friend. Like, Iran can play both sides. Russia's going to play both sides. Israel's going to support Azerbaijan. So, like, they don't have any other, like, friends there. You can say, well, Iran here or Russia there, but they really want to play both sides. It would be devastating for Iran to take the side of Armenia because there are ethnic Azerbaijanis living in Iran next to Armenia. In the northern part of Iran, you'd have a civil war erupt between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. So, like, yeah, I get kind of like the whole, well, maybe Iran's their second biggest ally because they really don't have anybody else. But Iran's not going to do anything because they also like Azerbaijan as well. And Azerbaijan geopolitically has kind of aligned themselves really well. So they have decent relations with Russia and Iran. They have good relations with Pakistan and Israel, great relations with Turkey, and decent relations with the United States. So, like, a lot of the conflicts in the Middle East, they've kind of stayed neutral, but they've also bought weapons from the West. And they've also bought weapons from the East. They're just trying to get the best weapons possible. And Armenia's, like you said, running out of friends. They don't have many friends in the world, which is one of the things from their Velvet Revolution in 2018 that they did, where they're trying to be more friendly to the West because they've realized that Russia is playing both sides. The problem with Armenia's Velvet Revolution is they changed the prime minister, but they didn't change out a bunch of the politicians in their government that were corrupt, would probably be the best way to put it, for the former government. So there's a lot of blockage in a lot of states. Now, Armenia has been growing as a result of the change of prime minister because more people have faith in them to do the right thing. But they're still really a corrupt Soviet republic. Same thing as Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's a dictatorship because they're a former Soviet republic. And as a former Soviet republic, if you don't have a dictatorship, the mafia runs everything.
Essentially, in the duration of the peace talks, the regional geopolitics have shifted. Today, there exists an asymmetric balance between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Yerevan wants to maintain the status quo, whilst Baku seeks to use its new leverage to overthrow the stalemate. The dynamic geopolitical circumstances, combined with the lack of trust, have resulted in the forestallment of a peace treaty. This was a Caspian report by me, Shiri.
So, okay. So we just covered the, and it just kind of breaks down kind of the origins in the Nagorno-Karabakh, showing the different territorial disputes in the region. Now, this wouldn't be a video if we didn't bring up fishing in the Caspian Sea for sturgeon, but also a few memes as well. So this one, Azerbaijan's friends versus Armenians' friends. But I think you can take Russia out of that sphere of influence because they want to play both sides. So Armenia's friends aren't that great. And you can take Iran out of Armenians' friends too because they don't want to do too much in the Azerbaijan because it'll affect their relationship with Pakistan. It'll also affect their relationship in the northern part of their territory. Syria is not really a friend. Greece is only a friend because Turkey gets involved. Like, it is a tough spot for Armenia. Now, the second meme, of course, is going to be about this war. They go to war, and then both sides are injured and have to visit the medics. So, but I plan on doing another video. Anthony brought up earlier, this is more from Caspian Sea, is more of an Azerbaijani source. But I have another source that goes over the 1994 conflict that is more pro-Armenian. And kind of as before, like, I know on these Azerbaijan and Armenian videos, I've gotten more views than I typically do. If you're an Azerbaijani or you're an Armenian, you want to talk about this conflict, contact me on Twitter. My handle is Jaeger of Pato. Or just contact me in the comments and I'll get a hold of you and we can just have a discussion kind of on your viewpoint, your side of things. So thank you for joining this video. And like I said, I'm going to do another one either tomorrow or Sunday. So have a good night. Good Friday night.